What's going on, guys? Welcome to another 6-yard workshop video. This week I'm going to show you exactly how I built these rustic modern nightstands and how I turned a huge mistake into a really awesome feature. Let's get into it. For this build, the client wanted to keep the cost down, so we decided to go with pine. I used 8-foot dimensional 2x10s to be exact. The design of these nightstands were simple. In fact, I was just copying what the client already had, but adding my own twist to it. After a few different design models, I picked one and I got to work. First thing I did was break down the lumber and mill it to its final dimensions. First I broke down the lumber into rough lengths, usually cutting about 1 inch over final size. Then I ran it through the table saw. First cutting a 1/4 inch off one side to eliminate the factory rounded corners, then flipping it over and trimming the board to its 8-inch final dimension. Then I planed everything down to its final thickness. There was no planned thickness number here, I was just trying to get rid of all the surface imperfections. I think I ended up taking it down to 1 1/4 inches in the end. As night fell, I began the glue up. I glued the 2 shelves and the top together. As I was gluing everything together, I realized I made a mistake I'm sure every woodworker has made. I was on autopilot mode. I cut 4 pieces to make 2 tops, 4 pieces to make 2 shelves, and 4 pieces to make 2 sides. However, I'm making 2 nightstands, which means I need 4 sides. Good thing I had a bit of extra wood on hand. I didn't film it the next morning, but I went through the exact same milling process. Once I glued those pieces together and they dried, I had everything I needed to start trimming to final dimensions. Since I knew 2 of the sides were parallel to each other, I used a framing square to make sure the cuts were perfectly square. I cut one end using my circular saw and a square as the guide. Then I used it to measure and mark where I'd make the other cut. I lined up my circular saw blade and cut the other side on this line. Once I had one piece, I could use it as a measuring guide to make the other pieces identical. With everything cut to its final lengths, it was time to sand. I won't bore you guys with the hours of sanding it takes, but I sanded each board on all 6 sides with 80 grit followed by 120 grit. Dados have easily become my new favorite type of joint. They're so simple yet effective. I set my table saw blade to a 1/4 inch, and then I set the fence to 1 1/2 inches. This will make the shelf sit 1 1/2 inches off the floor. I made my first pass on all 4 sides, then I moved the fence 1/8 of an inch and made all the cuts again. Once I got close to 1 1/4 inches wide for the dado, I snuck up on the final cut. I've seen experienced woodworkers say this, but I never really understood what it meant. What I figured out through a lot of trial and error is you don't want to overcut and have a loose dado joint. Once the dado is really close to its final width, I start moving the fence 1/32 at a time. Sometimes I'll move it a 64th at a time, like 3 or 4 times, just to get a perfectly snug fit. The glue was filmed poorly, and I apologize in advance. What I did was I set up one side and put glue along the dado. I placed the shelf into it, and then put glue along the other dado and placed that on top of the shelf. Once both sides were attached to the shelf, I used a clamp to make sure the top was the exact same width as the bottom, ensuring both sides were perfectly parallel with each other. Okay, so here's the big mistake I mentioned at the beginning. Just like the original sketch, this was supposed to be 16 by 20 with a 3/4 inch roundover on the sides. However, I mathed very wrong. I cut the shelves to 19 inches. Subtract a 1/4 inch for the dado on each side, and you have a top that's 21 inches, and the one I made was 20 inches, 1 inch too small. My options were either to redo the top or improvise. I decided to glue the top on anyways, giving a 1/2 inch gap on each side. I figured a plan would be to add an extra piece in the gap and then give it a round over, but I thought that would look kind of strange. So I figured I would try some sort of chamfered edge, kind of like this. I wasn't sure how it would look in real life, but it was worth a shot. So I cut the first 45-degree chamfer using a framing square, some squeeze clamps, and a circular saw. I used a really fine 80-tooth blade to minimize tear out. After cutting both sides, I thought it looked kinda cool. And after cutting all 4 sides, I thought it looked really cool. Once they were cut, they did take a lot of sanding. This time I started at 60 grit, moving to 80 and then 120. So minus the drawers, I'm finally done the fabrication part of this build. So before installing the drawers, I figured I'd stain them. This way, there's less in the way and it's easier to get into those tight corners. In case you guys are wondering, I'm using Varathane's all-in-one stain. It's super simple to apply. You generously wipe it on and then wait a few minutes before wiping it off. This stain doesn't require a wood conditioner, and this stain particularly is walnut in color. It actually does have a similar color to walnut, but pine cannot and will never replicate the grain patterns and characteristics of walnut. And although I think they looked really good without stain, it was added to better match the customer's current bedroom furniture. The next morning, I could start working on the drawers. For this, I used some 1/2-inch plywood. 4x8 sheets are a bit too large for me to break down on a compact job site saw by myself, so I buy them in smaller cuts, usually 2 foot by 2 foot. This was the perfect size because I could make 4 equal cuts at 6 inches, making the drawers 6 inches deep. So I cut them to their final lengths using my miter gauge with a built-in stop to keep the cut lengths consistent. I wanted to cut 1/4-inch rabbets into the sides to accept the front and back. That way when the drawers pulled out, the ugly plywood edges won't be visible. I used the bottom of my speed square to make sure the fence was a 1/4-inch from the blade. That'll make the bottom of the drawer sit a 1/4-inch up off the bottom of the sides. I made a pass on all 8 pieces, then I moved the fence 1/8 of an inch over, making the second pass. I knew the drawer bottom could be a bit looser, as no one would see the gap, and I'd be gluing it in place so it wouldn't shift around. So I made a third pass, taking off an extra 32nd of an inch or so, just enough that the drawer bottoms could slide into the drawer with ease. Then I set the fence to the thickness of the wood, minus 1/8 of an inch, aka the width of a saw blade, using the same 1/4 of an inch saw blade height to cut the rabbets into the sides. I made a pass on all 4 drawer slides, moving the fence 1/8 of an inch closer to the blade, and then put all 4 sides through the table saw again, and so on and so forth until there was no material left to take off. It is a bit annoying to make all these cuts without a dado stack, but it works just the same. These cuts came out so clean, and the rabbet accepts the sides perfectly. For the drawer bottom, I used a 1/4-inch piece of MDF that was actually an old coffee table template. I first cut it to width, then cut them both to length after, making sure all the cuts were 90 degrees from each other. I use the top of the table saw for assembly when I can, as I trust that it's the most flat thing in my shop. I am fortunate to work out of my landlord's garage. I cannot wait until we move into our new house with a fully unfinished basement that will be a real shop. I put a small bead of glue in all the dados and the rabbets, enough that it would help hold everything together, but not enough to get much squeeze out. Then I pre-drilled holes and used screws to hold everything together. So this was my first time ever attempting drawers, and as you can see, there was a huge learning curve. I wanted to make sure the drawers were level, but I couldn't really do that as I was unsure if my work surface was level. So I decided to use my speed square as a guide. This would make sure the drawer slides are being installed exactly 7 inches down from the top. Once I had them roughly fit, it was time to adjust them so that both sides would roll together. Each drawer was adjusted to a specific nightstand, and I didn't want to take the chance of having them go back into the wrong stand. So I marked the bottom of one drawer with an X and another one with an O. Then I made those same marks on the bottom side of the top of the nightstands. Now I could take the sides off the nightstand and get it ready for clear coat. I traced the outline of the drawer slides onto the nightstand. That way I would know exactly where they go when they get reinstalled. And I wasn't worried about these pen marks being visible in the final product. I removed all the hardware and then put them off to the side in their respective drawers. I applied 3 coats of water-based polyacrylic in total, sanding with 220 grit in between coats to knock back the raised wood fibers. The first 2 were matte. For the 3rd coat, I used a gloss polyacrylic. I also applied a 4th coat on just the top and sides, as I wanted them to have a bit of extra durability. When applying the last coat, I like to make sure I get a nice even distribution of the finish. So I do the perimeter first, then I apply a nice generous coat on the top. At the end, I go back and do full even pressured strokes from one side to the other, making sure to only go with the grain. Going with the grain helps hide the brush marks. With the drawer slides reattached and the drawers inserted, I could finally start the drawer fronts. I was considering making the drawer fronts out of pine and matching them with the same stain, but I had no pine left over. Out of the wood I did have on hand, I decided to go with brown maple. The brown in the maple is a little bit lighter than the walnut stain, however I feel they complement each other well. This will also make the drawer front the most aesthetic feature and very eye-catching. All of my lumber that isn't dimensional pine is S2S, which means it's surfaced on 2 sides, so I had all the usual tools out to mill these drawer fronts to perfection. As you can tell from this time lapse, I go back and forth between saws, using a combination of all 3 of them to get the job done. Normally I would also use a jointer here, but my jointer was broken at the time, and the sides of the maple were straight enough that I could get 2 parallel edges with just the table saw. I sanded both drawers on the front to 320 grit and 120 on the interface. I took them inside and finished them with a coat of Danish oil. This stuff is perfect for enhancing the natural color of wood, as well as bringing out the curliness and the pattern in the grain. Installing the drawer fronts was a complete pain. I've seen many different ways, but personally I don't know how to properly do them. I basically placed the nightstand on its back and centered the drawer front, leaving equal 1/16 inch gaps on all sides. I pulled the drawer outwards just a little bit while firmly holding the drawer face so it wouldn't shift, and then I put some squeeze clamps on to hold the drawer face in place while I installed a few screws from the back. Once I had a few screws in, I removed the squeeze clamps and then added more screws for reinforcement. I did the same thing with the second drawer, but I added a few shims into the bottom to make the face flush with the front of the nightstand. Then I screwed it on from the inside of the drawer as well, making sure to get a few screws running through the shims. Once it was all attached, I flipped it over and used a flush cut trim saw to remove the excess shim. Now listen, I am not an expert at installing drawers. This was my first time, and I can admit I had no idea what I was doing. If you guys have a better idea, please let me know below how it's done. I'd even take a link to another video if you guys have a really good recommendation. With the drawer sliding perfectly, the last and final thing to do was install some handles. They weren't absolutely necessary. The drawer can be opened by pulling on the bottom, but since they were nightstands, I figured it would be easier to open them with a handle if you're laying in bed. I chose some matte black, small T-handles. I went with something small and black to specifically not take away from the beauty of the maple drawer fronts. As much as I like them without the handles, I think the nightstands look really good, and they definitely serve their purpose. I'll be real with you guys, I didn't make much money off of these. I quoted material plus $10 an hour, expecting it to be about 10 hours. They took way longer. It ended up being just under $5 an hour, but that's okay. Right now I'm just trying to build a portfolio of products so I can launch a few new items together at once and start taking orders. So the fact that I was paid anything at all to build something I've never done before was a-okay with me. It gave me a ton of experience as well as a ton of knowledge on how to price things out in the future. Anyways, thanks for watching. This was a fun project and I learned a ton doing it. I hope you guys did too. If you like what you saw, subscribe so you never miss another video. Like the next one, which I'm going to show how I built this modern purple heart and walnut coffee table. Until then, cheers.